Okay, I'm going to start doing just these short videos about the chapters that we're covering in the hope that it'll help you guys grasp some of the important ideas from each of the chapters that we talk about. I know that the way that I teach this may not be the most exciting way to read a book, but I really want you guys to learn how to focus on understanding a text and understanding the details of it, because it is something that may come up. These sort of questions may come up later on in your English classes. So I do apologize for taking the fun away from the book, but I really do think that it's important for you guys to really be able to dig into the book and find the answers to these questions. With that, let me go through these two chapters. So our first chapter here is New York. And some of the new characters that we meet are one of them is Aunt Laura. So in this chapter, in the last chapter that we had about Ruth, chapter 11, we learn that she gets pregnant from her boyfriend Peter, and after talking with her mother, or her mother figures things out, she goes up north to New York to deal with this situation. Of pregnancy because of the danger for her and for Peter if she was to stay in Suffolk. We learned that in New York live her five aunts and also her uncle, and these are all of the children on her mother's side, not her father's side. And we also learned that this family is very wealthy. One of the things, if you think back to one of the reasons that her dad decided to marry her mother, who was disfigured, was to get to the United States. So she came from a very wealthy family. So he was really sort of taking advantage of a situation. So her mother also lives up there, Bubbe, and we'll get into there. So Aunt Laura is the oldest and richest of the aunts. Her husband is named Paul Schiffman, and they own a bunch of apartment buildings. One of the things that we learn about Aunt Laura is that she is a very fancy dresser, likes the finest things, has a maid, has a beautiful, I think it's a beautiful apartment with shiny hardwood floors and beautiful furniture. Oh, and it was a live-in German maid who cooked and kept house. So she's the oldest. The next one we learn about is Aunt Mary, and we don't totally have the birth order here for all of these, but Aunt Mary is younger than Laura. We know that much. We know also that she ran a clothing factory, and this is who Ruth worked for while she was up there in the summer. We also know that Aunt Mary treated Ruth very sort of harshly, ordering her around to do whatever. We also learned that Aunt Mary had two daughters, Lois and Enid, who didn't have to work and who weren't particularly friendly with Ruth. They they liked fancy things as well, but they wouldn't include Ruth in their outings. The uncle that we learn about is Uncle Hal, and he owned a kosher deli. So this kosher, we talked about this before it was on the test. Kosher is the dietary restrictions that Jewish people have. One of the notable things about it is that they can't mix meat and milk. So a kosher deli is a deli would be a restaurant. Normally they would serve sandwiches, or they would serve sliced meat or something like that, but the food there would be prepared according to the Jewish Orthodox Jewish traditions, so that people could go there who were Orthodox and get their food. Next one is Aunt Bernadette, who is married to a furrier, and what that means is someone who makes things out of fur, so like fur coats or fur scarves or fur hats or something like that. We learn about Aunt Rhonda. The only thing that we learn is that she hasn't spoken to Aunt Bernadette in 15 years, and nobody knows why, or some people know why, but you're not allowed to ask. And then the youngest was Aunt Betsy. And Aunt Betsy was the one who was nice to Ruth. So years later, when Ruth calls up to ask for help, Aunt Betsy says, "No, I won't help you. You're dead to us." But at that time, Aunt Betsy was the one who actually helped Ruth to get an abortion, and Ruth says she'll never forget that niceness. And then the last person is Bubbe, who's Ruth's grandmother, who is the person in her family who's the only person who she describes as truly loving her. So remember that her husband had died earlier, but she was still alive. All right, so the title of this is New York, and it's all about her trip to New York after she gotten pregnant. Um, Pregnant in Suffolk is the title of it. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But here's the basic plot. So in this one, we learn more about Ruth's extended family. We learned that her family was quite wealthy. We also learned that her aunts were very beautiful. So this is an interesting point for a couple of reasons. One reason is that we know that her mother, because of her disability, was not very beautiful and was treated very poorly. But we also know that that James describes his mother as very striking and very beautiful as well. So it's something that ran in her mother's family. The other thing, again, we learn is that this family has lots of secrets that just weren't talked about. That these things weren't shared. They cared a lot about money, that money was the most important thing for the family. That they didn't discuss painful topics. Again, that goes in with the secrets. And that they didn't show love. One of the things that Ruth says in this chapter is that the family would take care of you in the basic way. So there was a sense of like family obligation. So because Ruth was their niece, they felt they had to take her in and they had to help her at some level, but they didn't have to show love to her. They just showed it. They just did sort of the minimum. Okay. So this chapter ends basically with us learning that Ruth gets an abortion from this. One of the things to keep in mind then is that I'm not sure of all the legality, but if any of you guys know anything about the abortion debate, in the 1970s, there was a law case, there was a case before the Supreme Court, which was called Roe v. Wade, and you'll hear about it a lot in discussions now. But basically, it was a case that made abortion legal. Within the United States. So I'd have to go back and double check this, but the Ruth describes her abortion as very painful, and this was probably because it was an illegal. It was an illegal procedure. She describes it as a horrible, painful experience, and the doctor used no anesthesia. So there's no pain medication. So she felt, everything. So, back in those times, and one of the reasons why abortion was legalized is that when it was illegal, sometimes women would die getting these abortions. So this was something that still happened. Even though it was illegal. So that must have been a traumatic experience for Ruth to go through on her own as sort of a young child. All right, so moving on to the next chapter called Chicken Man. So again, we're switching back to McBride's point of view. The chapter before had been told from Ruth's point of view, and that was in the distant past. And now we're kind of up closer to the future. And James in this chapter is a teenager. We remember from the last chapter that at the end of it, we learned that his stepfather, who he called Daddy, had died because he'd had a stroke. So James was the oldest of the children who was at home, but he wasn't dealing with the situation very well. So we meet a couple of new characters here, and we'll talk about why later. But one of them is Big Richard, and Big Richard is Jack's husband. So if we remember, Jack came up earlier when his sister went and ran away. Helen, I believe it was, ran away from home and ended up going to Jack's house in Harlem. At this point, she's left Harlem and has moved to Louisville, Kentucky. So Louisville, Kentucky is not super close to where they are. Probably now from New York to there, maybe it would be, I don't know, 10-hour drive or maybe less than that, but it's not anywhere close. But McBride is sent to stay with her for the summer. And he really loves her husband, whose name is Big Richard, who he describes as a cool customer, who had a lot of rough friends, but was very street smart and never seemed to get caught up in things himself. Even though many of his friends, may have been arrested or been hurt, Big Richard seemed to be smart enough to stay above all of this. So you can imagine, for a teenage kid who's sort of rebelling against his mother's traditional values of having to, education and religion, how cool, someone who is a few years older than you, maybe 5, 10 years older than you, how cool someone like that might seem to you. So the other character who the title is after is Chicken Man, and the Chicken Man is a drunk. He's a drunk who's on the corner, and it describes him as, when he was drunk, he was incoherent, meaning you couldn't understand what he was saying, but that when he wasn't drunk, he was something of a philosopher, who would talk about life and give advice about life. So it also seems that McBride was also, admired Chicken Man and looked up to him and thought he was a cool guy. He did he did what he wanted. Um, the title of this, which we'll talk about, is Chicken Man, in part because Chicken Man really teaches James a lesson, and it is through Chicken Man that James makes a decision with his life to get off of doing some of the bad things that he's doing and turn his life around. And we'll talk about that in a little while. One of the things that we learn at the end of this chapter is that the Chicken Man ended up getting killed by his girlfriend after an argument. Another person we learn about is Herman, who is a manager of a gas station where McBride worked. He was a big and mean man, and the reason I list him here is that McBride ends up getting in a fight with him, and Herman grabs a gun and comes after him and takes a shot at McBride. And McBride feels that he should go and get a gun and go back and shoot Herman, but the Chicken Man says no, don't don't do that. That it's not going to end up well. It's not going to end up. So the title of this, like I said, is The Chicken Man. So our last chapter talked about a huge event in Ruth's sort of teenage years, where she went to New York and she took a big trip and she ended up getting an abortion. And in this one, it's the same sort of thing for McBride. He takes this big trip down to Louisville, where he's exposed to a completely new world, a world that he finds fascinating. In a same way, we learn briefly, and we'll learn more later, that Ruth is really fascinated by New York, and in the same way, McBride or James is really fascinated by the life that he sees on the corner. And he's really fascinated with Chicken Man in specific. So in particular, talking about the plot, at the beginning of this chapter, what we learn about is how McBride is dealing with the death of his stepfather, or more specifically, how he's dealing with his mom's grief. His mom is not handling it well. She has 12 kids. Maybe 6 or 7 of them are in college or graduate school. She's not making a lot of money. All of the money that she makes, she's putting into their education. And she still has, 6 or 7 small kids at home. She's working so much, she doesn't have the ability to really, keep an eye on all of her kids. And she's horribly upset. She's just lost her second husband, and she's not processing the grief, very well. And James, as sort of a typical teenage thing to do, it becomes something of a rebel. He ends up getting involved in some petty crime. He steals things from people on the street. He sells drugs. Things like this. So he's becoming a little bit of what we'd call a hoodlum. He stops going to school. He starts faking his report cards. A lot of really bad things. But he ends up getting caught by his mom, who finds out about his horrible grades, and she sends him to Louisville. Um, and this was actually, something that James or McBride was actually thrilled about, because for one thing, he loved his sister Jack. For another thing, he felt that when he was down there, that his sister was too busy to keep an eye on him, so he could sort of do whatever he wanted to. So he ends up getting an education sort of in street life, and he spends a lot of time on the corner with Big Richard, and he spends a lot of time with Chicken Man, who is always philosophizing. At one point, Chicken Man speaks to him very, very seriously and challenges McBride about what he believes. McBride is sort of going around with this attitude of like, yeah, I can, I don't need to go to school. I can drop out. I can make it. And the Chicken Man challenges this. He says, what do you think makes you so special? Nobody cares. You think you're so smart because you're so good because you used to get good grades, right? You think that everybody is going to beg you to come back to school. That's not going to happen. While he's down there on the corner, he sees some violence happening. He shot at himself. He sees a man and a woman get into a horrible argument where the man ends up beating up the woman in front of him, and then later on. There's a threat by another man who said he's going to come and shoot the man who had been doing the beating. Um, so he sees how violent life is on the corner, um, and uh, and the final lesson really that the Chicken Man teaches him is that Chicken Man ends up dead. He has an argument with his girlfriend. He leaves, not thinking anything of it, and then later that night he ends up dead. So this is a real eye-opening experience for James to see where he might head if he doesn't make a change with his life. Okay, so I hope that this is helpful. I recommend read through this, answer the questions for the journal. We'll take some time in class to go over some of the questions that I think are important. But bring any questions that you have. I hope this helps. Take care. Bye.